And he said to me, look, it's very dangerous. And if you are arrested, you will be tortured and likely killed. Destabilize what was still at that time a very fragile, I mean, we're talking about 1995, democratic government. On the 24th of December, there is a bomb attack. There's an ambush on a number of police officers.
Welcome to Crossing the Line, a weekly podcast show in which we talk to people from different sectors of our society about the problems and the issues troubling our country, our continent, and our world. My name is Ryland Fisher, and I'm your host. I want to thank Mobilearn for the support for this project, and I want to thank the technical team for making me look good behind the scenes. Thank you for joining us. Our guest today is David Africa, the author of Lives on the Line. This book has been described as a spy thriller. Imran Bakkes, the editor of Al-Kalam, writes here, he says, Lives on the Line is a gripping espionage thriller where trust is a gamble and the price of failure could be death. I want to talk about the book, obviously, but I want to maybe start off a little bit before then, talk about kind of not your growing up years, but your growing up years in struggle, Manenberg, joining the student movement, and how all of that stuff impacted on, and in fact, then going to join the ANC, spending 2 years military training in Uganda, I think. How all of those kind of things impacted on what you did later in your life.
So as you say, I grew up in Manenberg. Becoming involved in political activity in my teenage years was, in a sense, logical because my father was quite active in community, in the civic, for example, community activities. But there was also, and I think this shaped the way in which I was involved in struggle quite a lot. There was a big sort of, let's say, a theoretical element to becoming involved in struggle. What do I mean by that? When I was probably about 10, between the ages of 10 and 14, my mother used to go to Claremont to shopping every Saturday, sometimes just to buy 2 or 3 things. But the reason she went to Claremont was because there was the Kafta bookshop in Claremont. And my father gave her a certain amount of money, which she had to buy books for me. So she would drop me at Kafta and go to, I think it was Grand Bazaar. And I would be in the bookshop for 2 hours, or however long she took. And this is where I discovered books that were very interesting politically. Some of them I didn't quite understand at the time, because they were mostly university books. So university students, when they were done with the year, they would sell their books or donate it to Capstone. But I read these books. Some of them were history books, some of them were theoretical, philosophical books. And so this sort of grabbed me and developed a philosophical, theoretical interest in radical politics, which was just obviously a sort of idea in my head, because I was not active in politics at the time. Then 1985 happened, and all of us, obviously, who were at school at the time, became involved in the uprising. And I was in my second year of high school in Manenberg, Phoenix High School. And that's where I became involved in the sense of being elected onto the SRC, so being a class rep. And then obviously from there, you know, some of us then became involved in the Manenberg Students Congress after COSAS was banned, and then provincially in Western Cape Students Congress, together obviously at the same time with becoming active in the local UDF structures, the youth and so on, KEICO at the time. So that was my sort of formative political experience, and I was always, let's say, a bookish type of person in struggle, in that I never really liked, for example, to speak at mass rallies, and because I just didn't like it. You know, I actually, even now I don't like crowds. But obviously then we were always in crowds and mobilizing and so on. But I was always more interested in reading. Obviously then theory, Marx, Lenin, and so on, whatever else was available. And then I was recruited into the ANC in 1988, into the political underground of the ANC in the first instance.
So how old were you at that point?
17. I was 17. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting because actually the first time someone tried to recruit me, I was about a year earlier, when I was obviously 16. And I, even though one obviously knew what the struggle was about and so on, but the person who tried to recruit me for MK was quite crude in the way in which he put it, you know, and I was thinking afterwards, how do you say, and this is pretty much how he put it to me. It's a comrade actually whose brother was hanged from KZN. And he said to me, look, it's very dangerous. And if you are arrested, you will be tortured and likely killed. And I was 16. Now, he was obviously very specific because his brother, who was an MK soldier, was hanged.
Yeah.
And I just said no. I just said no. You know, I didn't. I mean, I couldn't process it properly. You know, because obviously you sing about MK and you know about Fisher and so on, and obviously at the time this was a thing that was not really done in the sense that obviously a comrade had now trusted me, exposed himself to me. And then there were a number of meetings, you know, between me and him, because he was now worried, obviously, that he had played his hand, and I had said no. And I mean, it was interesting because he was obviously significantly older than me, but I had to sort of reassure him that, look, I just don't think that I'm ready for this thing, you know, and especially the way in which I didn't say the way in which you put it, but obviously. Anyway, in 1988, I was then recruited into the political underground. And I worked then obviously in the underground until 1990, when the ANC was unbanned. I also became then active in the Communist Party. And then I was obviously trained in the underground here at home. And then in 1992, I went to Johannesburg to report a certain matter there to the military headquarters, to a comrade who later on became the chief of defense intelligence. And then I was told that I have to leave the country. Without much reason being given, it was sort of alluded that it was because of the issue I came to report. But obviously at that time, one didn't really ask too many questions. I mean, you were in the underground, and so you obviously, generally, you took instructions. So I then I left the country and I came back. I went to Uganda, underwent sort of conventional military training there, because then obviously the negotiations were ongoing about the establishment of, a new military in post-apartheid South Africa. And so some of us were trained conventionally now, doing officers training and so on, with the intent obviously of coming back and joining the new defense force. So I came back at the end of June 1994, came back into the country. Obviously with the intent on the part of the ANC that, like everyone else, I should be integrating into the new military. But I decided not to do so. Because I was never really, I mean, I did well in the military training and so, but I was never really interested in being a soldier. Because obviously it was political what we were doing at that time. And I didn't see myself as sort of wearing a uniform and marching up and down and so on. So I left actually the military just to pursue a normal career.
So what did you do in that time?
When I came back, you mean?
Yeah. What was a normal career?
A normal career, I actually applied for a job at UCT. UCT had just established at the time a youth center in Crossroads, in New Cross. So the New Crossroads Youth Center. And I applied for a job there as a youth leadership trainer. And this center was funded by UCT, and it was part of UCT, a UCT project in New Cross. So when I left school, I had a job at ERP as a student leadership trainer. And so now I was a youth leadership trainer.
So ERP stands for Education, Research and Information Project.
Yes. So I worked, because every year ERP took 2 Wexco leaders when they left school and employed them, basically to run workshops for Wexco, under the tutelage of people at ERP, Marie Michelle, Nasir Jaffa, and others, uMkhonto. So that was before I went to Uganda. And so I went to work in Crossroads, New Cross. I enjoyed the job. It was a lovely job working with young people. And then I was there for less than a year, because definitely less than a year. A comrade of mine from Menenberg used to frequent my office and try to convince me to join the integration of ANC intelligence people into the NIA, the new international.
So at that point, did you have any intelligence training?
I had, well, apart from what I had in the underground, which was probably the best training I had, sort of military combat work. In Uganda, I had military intelligence training, which was tactical level military intelligence training. Then before we integrated, because I was meant to integrate into the NIA, but by the time I sort of agreed to this, okay, let me join, leave my job now and join this integration thing, the NIA integration was completed, and I then integrated into crime intelligence. So before we integrated, we were then trained specifically in intelligence. The group of us that were now going to be integrated, some of these are comrades who had worked in DIS, the ANC Department of Intelligence and Security, by the time I joined them. So we had, over a few months intelligence training, which was run by Jeremy Beery, basically to prepare us for this integration into crime intelligence now.
Okay. And so you joined the police,
Mm.
and in the police, you find a lot of people who used to be on the other side. Um, in fact, some of the people who used to hunt activists and including the guy who used to hunt you, a guy called Chris Martin,
Mm.
which I think is a pseudonym he used, who eventually became your subordinate in the PAGAD unit. So let's talk about that experience. Kind of, it must have been a bit weird, suddenly sitting across the room and having to call these guys colleagues. When not so long ago,
Yes, yes.
they would torture you and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it was quite a surreal experience, because obviously we had known these people either by name or we had seen them. Martin, for example, which is a pseudonym, is a very well-known security policeman in Cape
Mm.
Town. And I had seen him many times. He would often be sort of on the fringes of a march or so on. You know, they were always looking out, obviously, monitoring activities. I also heard from him often because he was very active. I mean, he was one of the leading people in investigating, arresting, detaining, torturing, I suppose, yes, student and youth activists. And obviously comrades, you know, when they come out of detention would then say, I was interrogated by so-and-so, and his name was always there. So he was one of the people that I met together with other people. I mean, there's another guy who used to come to my house, Talliard, who had actually left intelligence, crime intelligence it was called at this point, but he would often come to the office to visit his colleagues, his old colleagues, you know, and they introduced me to him. He's the one actually who mostly came to my house. So you meet these people, and I don't know if it was more difficult for us or for them, because we obviously, in a sense, we were victorious. We were all supposed to be dead or locked up somewhere, but yet we are now here in the offices, not by their invitation. They had no choice in us being there. And in many instances, we were at the same rank or higher than they were. So I think it was quite painful for many of them to process. For us, especially comrades who were arrested, tortured, and so on, it was obviously a particularly intense experience, you know, being with these people. But I do think that our politics sort of buffered, in a sense, what otherwise would have been a very raw kind of emotional engagement, you know, because we obviously chose as individuals to join this integration, knowing what it was about, knowing that we are not going there finding no one there. We knew that we will be finding these people there, and we were better prepared, I think, than they were, you know, psychologically in a sense. So, but what was fascinating was one obviously has the worst kind of expectations of these people. I suppose like they had of us, you know. But once you start working, there's a certain number of them that you can work with quite comfortably. I mean, a lot of them obviously said, you know, it was just a job for us. I mean, some of them quite enjoyed, obviously, torturing and killing people. But then there were others who were really highly professional people. You know, for whatever reason, ended up joining the security branch. So that initial, let's say, first few 6 months was quite difficult to navigate, because amongst them, there were many characters who were trying to sabotage, you know, always questioning your qualifications, your this and your that. I mean, it wasn't for them to question, because we had been brought in by the government, which was an ANC government. But some of them were very problematic. The majority sort of just accepted it. The majority who were there, many of them obviously having left before we integrated.
So you end up getting involved in the PAGAD or the unit, kind of investigating PAGAD, and this book is based on that experience. This happened, 25 years ago? Why now? Why? But also, why did you write this book? When I was reading this book, and I was like thinking, I was trying to identify the people who had pseudonyms, and in some cases, I think I could identify them because I knew them or I knew of them. And so I was also wondering about whether there's some of the PAGAD guys that you put away, reading the book and kind of trying to see, okay, who were the impimpies and all of that stuff,
Yes.
So
Yeah.
So should you have written a book like this?
Look, all the people who are mentioned there, let's say as people who were sources for us, are people who came out in public. I still chose not to use their real names, but they testified in court cases, for example, against PAGAD people, or they were exposed in the media by the police. So there's no one in there that has not been outed. Exactly what they did and how they came to work for us, obviously, is a different matter. But these are all people who have, by and large, testified in court cases. These events took place between 30 and 25 years ago. That's one of the reasons I felt more comfortable writing it now than immediately after, which I did start then actually, but I realized that it's inappropriate at the time to write this book because either I have to expose things which are still sensitive, or I would have to write a book where I can basically say nothing, neither of which I wanted to do. So I parked it, and I thought at some point it would be okay to write about this thing. I obviously also had to then, because life goes on and you do other things. So I obviously then at some point had to sort of gain the excitement to write the book. Otherwise, it's a painful process. So, about 3 years ago, I then started to write again. I think, some people feel that there's a general, let's say, ban on writing these sorts of books. I don't hold that view. I think it's a very sort of old view, because of transparency on the one hand, and certain things already having come out, in court cases or in the media or in other books that's been written. What I have done is to provide, obviously, a particular angle, a look into this story. And there's some background that other people don't have that I had. And also, because I was involved from day one, I have a certain sort of analytic lens on the thing, which other people might not have or might not be interested in having written other types of books. I thought that the benefit of writing a book like this is more than the greatly diminished risks that now would be, let's say it would present to anyone who's mentioned in the book by real or other names, myself included. Because I thought that there are many reasons why this book has to be written now. And it overrode to me the idea of not writing about these things.
In your opinion, looking at PAGAD, did you think that PAGAD started out kind of legitimately in an honorable way. Because, I mean, listen, gangsterism and drugs, it's a huge problem in Cape Town, and it needs to be combated. So did they start off honorably, or do you think there was always this intention of kind of becoming what they became?
I will say, I think, because one should never be too certain of
Mm.
one's knowledge being fact. I think that it was intended as a project to achieve a number of things politically. One was to raise the political profile of the organization that founded, in my hypothesis, PAGAD, that is Qibla. The second was to destabilize what was still at that time a very fragile, I mean, we're talking about 1995, democratic government, which Qibla had never seen as legitimate, even though it was democratically elected. So it's also a pattern of behavior on the part of Qibla, in the sense that historically Qibla had mobilized through other organizations, fronts, let's call them fronts, or ad hoc committees and structures established for this or that campaign. I don't think they could have imagined themselves how successful it would have been, because none of the things they had done, you know, in the previous years were really particularly successful. The PAGAD surprised them greatly, because obviously they had found the issue around which to mobilize, which, as you say, is a very credible and a real issue. It's not like the issue of drugs and gangsterism is manufactured. I mean, it's there and it's affecting most people on the Cape Flats very directly. So I think that there was an intent to establish this thing called PAGAD and to achieve these political aims. The typical person who joined PAGAD, 90% of them or more, obviously was not aware of this background. I mean, even the intelligence services were not always aware of this background, until obviously you start investigating and you recruit people who were in these meetings before PAGAD became public, who then says, we had a meeting here, so-and-so, and we discussed this thing of PAGAD, establishing a thing like PAGAD and so on. That's where you find the real sort of origin of the thing. But for the ordinary PAGAD person, by and large, it was a legitimate campaign to combat gangsterism and drugs, and to force the government to do something serious about it.
Let's talk about one of the pivotal issues that came, or that formed part of your book, but it also formed part of the evolution of PAGAD, the death of, or rather not the death, the murder, the killing of Rashid Slaghi. You were aware that things could potentially go wrong. That fateful night, you know, when he was killed in front of his house in Salt River, you tried to alert your colleagues in the police, and they ignored you. Why do you think that was so?
It's Rashad Slaghi.
Sorry, Rashad, sorry.
So I don't know if there was any malicious intent in ignoring what I was saying. Remember that until then, PAGAD had started attacking drug dealers, you know, throwing a petrol bomb, a pipe bomb, and so on. but obviously the murder of Staki and the way in which took place was completely unprecedented. So firstly, because I get the reports from a number of sources that says, since we are going to Staki's house on Sunday, this is now in the week preceding, we are planning something spectacular. Planning in the sense that generally, since we are going to his house, it's not just going to be a normal march, because everyone knows who Staki is. Secondly, I don't even want to call it analysis, because anyone on the Cape Flats will know that if you have PAGAD marchings to Staki's house, something is bound to happen. Now, everyone assumes that Staki obviously will not be there, because he also knows they are coming to his house. I write a report on the Friday to say, because of information and let's call it analysis, we can expect this march to be more violent than previous ones. And therefore, a higher police presence is recommended. Now, remember, we can't deploy the police. I mean, we don't have we don't have powers to deploy people, but we can obviously say this and that factors lead us to believe the following, and please send more cops, basically. That's the Friday afternoon. I complete that report just after 4 because the office is quite empty when I send it off. Obviously, these people who are dealing with public order policing, they are working 24/7, so someone receives it, you know. But on the evening of the march itself, when they proceed, because they gather as usual at the mosque in Gatesville, from where they then drive to a certain place and then march. There's one police van, which obviously is not suitable for, even if 10 people are going to march to Staki's house, you should have more than one police van. But here you have several thousand people now. It's a huge crowd. And by the time the motorcade, because it's first a motorcade, gets to Salt River, there are some additional cops, but clearly not enough to deal with a number of people here. And people are armed. I mean, it was standard in PAGAD marches that most of the men would be armed. You know, it's pistols and shotguns and whatever. Obviously, some people have hand grenades and pipe bombs, which they don't openly display. So the police is completely unprepared for this. Now, there are two theories as to why this is the case. The one is that they simply did not think that the threat is so significant that they should be there in numbers. The other, which has never been investigated, is that they intentionally underdeployed. And even at the scene, when Staki arrives there, I mean, there's a number of odd things that happen because he is let through the police barricade because there's now a roadblock, but he is let through somehow, which obviously is quite unusual in the sense that there are thousands of people who are here to kill you. We are the police. We stop you. You say you want to go through. We say, okay, sir, fine, no problem, pass through. So that's very odd, and it's never ever been investigated. Even the inquest that was held did not really investigate the public order response at the before and at the scene there where he is killed. Instead, the focus was on the intelligence people who were there and to what extent they, meaning myself and Martin, might have been involved in this killing, because there is then a theory that we were involved in killing him.
Sure. So yes, I mean, there were a couple of things. The one, they ignored you. The one, the second one was the fact that they didn't try to stop the protesters, but I suppose they couldn't stop the protesters because they were under-resourced.
Yeah, there was no way they could stop them.
And then, of course, when Stachy gets killed, and this is where it becomes personal for me, um, the police, all the police who were there, don't see anything. They're all on the phone, or they're all, speaking to their girlfriends, or they, I don't know, they took a break, at that point. And then in order for you to try to make a case, you decide you want to subpoena the media. And I was editor of the Cape Times at the time. And of course, you tried to subpoena my Roger Friedman and Benny Gould to submit whatever they, like the photos and stuff that they took today. I have been wondering for many, many years who was behind taking the decision. Reading a book, I see that Bulelani was the guy who took the ultimate decision.
Yeah.
How involved were you in the decision? Did you consider at the time that the implications that issuing subpoenas to the media to testify, the implications of what it would mean for media, for journalists doing the work, or were you so just hell bent on getting a win in that case?
The first proper discussion on the media takes place. I remember Stachy's killed in August 96. The first time this thing is properly discussed is in December 99. And by that I mean the actual meeting is on 25 December 1999. This is the context in which the issue of the media is discussed. So it's 3 years, more than 3 years, after the incident itself occurs. Now, there are two things that shape this conversation and decision. The first thing is that on the 24th of December, there is a bomb attack. There's an ambush on a number of police officers at Mano's cafe in Greenpoint. Several of them are critically wounded and so on. Now, cops have been, attempted murder, basically. And so the government, in the person of the minister or several ministers, and the president decides that something must be done about this thing. Because now these people are blowing up police officers. That is the immediate thing that causes this meeting to be held on the 25th of December 1999. When we have this meeting, and the question is, the people directly involved in this bombing which happened last night, or the people who instruct them, how can we get these people behind bars? Obviously using the law. We then say, let us look at old cases which might have fruitful grounds to pursue. One of them, logically, is the Stachy murder. So we then ask the advocate leading the prosecution, or let's say the investigation, to bring the file. When he brings the file, it's basically empty, meaning that we've had 3 years of no work. I can't remember there being more than one written page in that file. So you have an attack which demands a response. You then have a number of cases where there is evidence. Obviously, evidence is, for example, photographs and video taken by journalists. Now, whether it's appropriate to then obtain that evidence, and there you need to compel the journalist to testify, is a different question. But what you know is that there's evidence. There's evidence of some people's guilt, and these people are the people who planned these attacks, including last night's attack. it is in this context that this conversation is had. Bulelani is one of the people in the meeting. I think the Minister of Justice was also there. Penuel, the police,
Maduna.
yeah, Matuna's there, Celebi's there, Chwete's there, and us as obviously as their subordinates, intelligence people, and some people from IDOC, which became the Scorpions, are there in this meeting. So there, the question is then raised: if we arrest the people who were involved in the Staggie murder, under whatever charges, how are we going to get the evidence? Because the only evidence we have of the murder itself, not what leads up to it, because there I can testify. By then I had already testified in an inquest about what leads up to this situation. But like these cops who were on the phone with their girlfriends, I am also not there at the moment that it happens. I mean, for a legitimate reason, but I'm just not there, so I can't testify to the actual murder. It seems to us in this meeting that the only people who can testify to the actual murder are the journalists. This decision, I assume it was taken by the Director of Public Prosecutions, who I would imagine is really the only person authorized to take such a decision. We obviously had the conversation in the meeting, and different people gave different views, you know. But the decision was, there was no decision taken in the meeting itself. It was obviously taken subsequent, because there were then attempts, as you say, to get Benny Gould and what's his name, Benny's the Roger to testify. So I would imagine that was Bulelani, who was the director, the National Director of Public Prosecution, who had taken that decision.
Yeah, sure. You know, it was a tough period, and I can tell you that we as journalists, we grappled with. We wanted to see justice being done, but we also thought about the safety of our journalists, not just in that instance, but in general. You know, journalism works on your sources being able to trust you, and if you now suddenly, you know, testify, I mean, how will they trust you after that?
Yeah.
But that's my issue. So, you know, you spoke about the number of firearms that people carried. Did anybody ever find out about whether any of these firearms were legal, illegal, where they came from?
Most of the firearms were legal firearms. Remember that many of the people who joined PAGAD's G-Force used to be members of neighborhood watches. So many of them, often they had their personal firearms, which they used in attacks. Later on, especially when it came to murders, now the initial attacks, they would shoot at the house of a drug dealer. And if someone would be injured or not, and they were using their private firearms. But when they really started operating as hit squads, they obtained illegal firearms, which they just bought as you can. You and I can go to Manawak now, and in half an hour we can have guns. So they bought this on the black market. Rifles, they obtained by raiding police stations. Remember, they raided Claremont police station, where they emptied the armory. The same in Stellenbosch police station. So this was when they now obtained high-powered, assault rifle and so on, which in the latter years, let's say 98 onwards, they were using those kinds of firearms. Then they had a connection at the Denel plant in Swartklip, where initially they got hand grenades. And for the rest, I mean, they were manufacturing, obviously, the bombs themselves.
So how do you decide, how do you define success in, of an intelligence operation? In this case, I mean, there were results, and you did kind of put some people away. Some of those people, I think, are out already. And some of them have gone back to PAGAD. So do you think, I mean, there's a possibility of the PAGAD thing flaring up again, for instance,
Yeah. So, look,
or the military kind of stuff with the PAGAD, yeah.
yes. When you are targeting, intelligence obviously has different objectives depending on the target you are dealing with. So one has to define one's objectives in advance as you are commencing an operation so that you know what you are working towards. To us, it was to put a complete stop to the attacks that PAGAD was carrying out. We never thought that it is important for us to stop PAGAD from marching and protesting. So this was really of no concern to us. We obviously knew that the marches served multiple purposes, one of which was to target people, meaning we are marching to your house, you are a target, right? But also to work up emotions and also to recruit people then into the G-Force, the paramilitary wing of PAGAD. So our objective was that there must be a complete stop to PAGAD attacks. That the organization or the part of PAGAD that's carrying out these attacks, meaning the G-Force, must cease to function as an entity capable of carrying out sustained operations. That was our objective. Many people thought that we were over-ambitious in the sense that they were operating PAGAD and the G-Force at a very high tempo and they were very successful. So if we could at least mitigate.
And also very brazen.
They were. Oh, no, they were very capable. They were very, very capable and competent people. If we could mitigate that, let's say reduce the number of attacks. But we thought that reducing is not really an option because it will leave a residual capability that they can then stand up very quickly again and increase, and so we wanted to make the thing collapse basically. That was how we saw the targeting of PAGAD and what would be a satisfactory outcome for us. Now, you are dealing with a very capable adversary that has people who are very committed ideologically and religiously. All right? When you are saying we are going to kill this thing, you obviously have to have the means to do it because you are not dealing with just a few guys standing on a street corner. And you must design, obviously, an operation that can achieve that and actually carry it out. So we were fortunate because we had very good, whilst we had a lot of trouble in the province with the police leadership here, we had a lot of support at head office from Celebi as the National Commissioner, Tim Williams as the Commissioner, the Divisional Commissioner for Crime Intelligence, and the Crime Intelligence head office generally. So we had a lot of support there. We had very capable people leading this charge in the province. We had exceptionally good relationships with the NIA, which at the time was led by Arthur Fraser here, and with the military, who provided us a lot of technical and other operational support. So when you put all of those things together, you can sort of take on such let's say, a grand objective. I mean, everything must still fit together well. Otherwise, it's easy for these things also to sort of, go off the wheels. But we thought that we must be ambitious and that we must set up the capability to achieve that sort of ambitious aim.
How many people went to prison as a result of your work?
Not many. I don't think more than 12.
Mm.
Yeah.
But that was enough to break the organization.
Some people you can send to prison, the right people. In other words, if it's not just a number, you must target the right people. And if you remove them from the equation, you can impact significantly. Firstly, by their absence, because they are the people who've been running the thing. They know where to get the weapons. They know how to make bombs. They have the trust of the people who are going to plant the bombs. That's very important. They have the personality to motivate people. These are all things that you need if you want to carry out that kind of thing. So one has to select these people quite carefully, and they are not always the most senior people. They could be low down, but let's take Ibrahim Jenica, for example, who had killed a large number of people. But he could drive the people he was working with in his team to do extraordinary things, high risk, I mean, raiding a police station is you're going to a police station, locking up the cops and taking their weapons. I mean, that's quite a bold kind of a move. And then you do it again. Even when the cops are now alerted to it, you do it again. So you have to remove the right people, and you have to, the first thing you have to do is to figure out what makes this thing, let's say G-Force, tick. How does this thing hang together? And who makes this thing work? Because it's like in a business. There might be 1,000 people working there, but there are actually only 33 people who make this thing what it is. Other people are doing things because they are told. Pick this up, drop it there, whatever. You have to figure out that first, and that is an intelligence task. Who are the key characters here that make this thing tick over day to day, day to day? And then you target those people.
So there are some people who will say that you did a fantastic job kind of, countering PAGAD's terrorism. And we can talk about that also in terms of the fact that the irony of former terrorists, so-called terrorists, kind of defining an organization as a terrorist organization, and then kind of spending all this energy kind of challenging the organization. But the other thing that some people might say is, why can't you spend all these kind of resources combating gangsterism? Gangsterism is probably the biggest problem that we have on the Cape Flats.
Well, I would be one of those people who would say that. The first thing one has to know is that PAGAD was brought down probably by about 15 people out of the entire police. So it's not as if the whole police was dealing with PAGAD. In the end, it was a small group of intelligence officers in crime intelligence working with a small group of intelligence officers in the NIA and a small group of intelligence people in the military, together with a few prosecutors in the NPA, together with very few detectives. That was the totality of the capability that targeted PAGAD. Until the last 6 months, the crime intelligence capability dealing with PAGAD was about 5 people. So it's not as if even a small amount of the police's resources were focused on PAGAD. What obviously we had was support, political support for dealing with PAGAD. What we also had was a strategy for what we wanted to do with PAGAD. And what we also had was very capable leadership, together with some other things, skills and so on, determination. That is what I think needs to be replicated with gangs on a much larger scale. Now, you can't approach gangs in the same way as you do PAGAD because it's a different type of, let's say, intelligence problem. So you have to approach it differently. But there are some principles, and this is one of the reasons I wrote the book, because I thought that there are lessons from that experience that should be used in, for example, gangs, organized crime, corruption, extortion, and so on. Because what we did, apart from dealing with PAGAD, was to develop a trade craft of intelligence, a way of doing intelligence, a way of leading intelligence operations, a way of integrating efforts between ourselves and the military, for example, a way of working with detectives and prosecutors, which exist in paper. Like you always hear about integrated approach and what do they call it, fusion centers, but they never work, or they rarely work. So we had a thing that worked. And I think the model needs to be explored, and to see and to be resourced at the scale that one can deal with gangsterism and the drug trade and organized crime.
Do you think that the incompetence of the state has something to do with the rise of an organization like PAGAD? Because the state is unable to deal with the issue. So people feel that they must take it into their own hands to deal with the issue of crime, gangsterism, drug dealing, etc.
When we talk specifically of PAGAD, I mean PAGAD in 1995.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one could argue also as whether there is room for a legitimate organization to do the kind of work that PAGAD ostensibly was supposed to do,
Yes. No, I think there is. And in fact, one cannot deal, especially with gangsterism, just by using the state's capabilities against gangs. I mean, it's a sort of quintessential problem that is an all of society problem. Civil society, NGOs, the government, the education department, and so on. I mean, all government departments or multi-departmental should be involved in dealing. So, I mean, there's no reason why there shouldn't be organizations like PAGAD who are campaigning against gangsterism and drugs, protesting against it, and protesting against the state's failure to deliver its most fundamental function, which is to keep people safe. There's no reason why there shouldn't be. I mean, people can't just accept that we have 28,000 murders a year in South Africa, and that's fine. The more incompetence we see, obviously, the more people feel compelled to take things in their own hand, which is not legal, but one can debate whether it is a legitimate response. I mean, how long do you give the state to make sure that people are safe? And so it will happen inevitably that people take the law into their own hands.
Yeah.
PAGAD was different in the sense that they launched this attack against the democratic government a year and a half after it had come to power, which obviously no sensible person could believe that you can deal with gangsterism in 1.5 years. It's just not possible. But 30 years in, the situation is worse. If we just take the Cape Flats, and there are no signs, I mean, from where I'm sitting, that the kind of leadership, the kind of strategy, the kind of commitment, and sort of aggressive effort that was there during the PAGAD thing has any chance of emerging, from the present political or police leadership.
But wasn't a key factor also the fact that guys like you, Jeremy Weary, Nazim Dramat, the kind of background you came from, kind of from the Cape Flats, but getting involved in political organization in the Cape Flats, being conscientized in terms of understanding the dynamics, class, race, etc., dynamics, and then being able to apply that in the work that you did. And that also kind of a serious factor in your success, as opposed to the old security police, Skopskiet and Donner,
Yes. I suppose there were a number of, let's say, skills we had developed in struggle and in the underground that helped us deal with the kind of problem that PAGAD presented. Because PAGAD presented, on the one hand, political problem. It's a public movement that's protesting, mobilizing support, like we used to. And then it has a paramilitary wing that's obviously operating in secret and carrying out attacks, like we used to. So we obviously had a good sense of how these two things function together, political and military. We also had a good sense of how you run a secret organization, the rules of it and so on, so that we could imagine how these people were functioning, and how you would sort of peel apart that kind of entity. So definitely there were many things we learned by doing during the struggle, and also that we learned politically. We also learned about things like strategy and tactics, the necessity of strategy, how to align tactics with strategy. Those are things that we learned in struggle, which we now took into our professional lives in the state. But I know for myself and the people that you mentioned, so Anwar Dramat, Jeremy and others, that we were very driven to put an end to the violence that PAGAD was carrying out, because we thought that people had fought for this democracy, and people had not fought for a situation where they can't go to a shopping mall because a bomb might explode there. Where if you disagree with PAGAD, you would find your house being pipe bombed. And so that was a big driving factor in our determination to put an end to it. Because remember, the reason we joined the police was not to get a job as a policeman, but because we thought that part of our work, it was political, that we had to defend this democracy where many people had died for, and which we ourselves had fought for. And one of the ways of doing that obviously was in the police, in intelligence. And so that really drove, it really energized us, because there were moments, many, many moments, where we were struggling and people were trying to sabotage us and so on, and people were trying to kill us. But these were the kinds of things that really encourage us to just keep on going.
So many years ago, I spoke to Chris van Wyk, just after he wrote his book, Surely Goodness and Mercy. And one of the things he said to me was the most difficult thing he had with writing a book was to decide who to name and who not to name. Who would take offense, who wouldn't take offense. And how did you... In fact, he decided eventually to use pseudonyms for everybody.
The first hurdle I had to overcome was in my own head, which was that I am not writing a book by committee, which was sort of instinctively how one was brought up politically, collective this and collective that and so on. But when you are writing a book of this type, I suppose there are books that you can write together and so on. But when you are writing a book of this sort, you are writing obviously about facts, things that happened, but you are also interpreting events because you are trying to say what are the lessons in this whole thing. And so I decided to write without consulting people. I'm writing my recollection of events and my reflection upon these events. Now, who do you name and who don't you name? There are people, obviously, who have, subsequent to the PAGAD thing, assumed, let's say, important public office, or they've risen in the ranks, and often accompanying their various promotions was mention of their critical role in PAGAD, which led to them being promoted, and which was obviously appropriate at the time, having been successfully involved in this operation. Such people are mentioned by name because everyone knows that you are the person who played a central role in PAGAD, this and that and the other. As I said, other people who are not, let's say, who had not developed a public profile, I decided to use pseudonyms. Some of them are still, for example, working in the police. Some of them I don't know because I left intelligence, at which point they stopped working, for example, as sources to intelligence. Even the people who testified in court, I use pseudonyms because, I don't know what the circumstances are now, for example. So it was very much a case by case basis. Some of these people, I asked them, can I mention you by name? And if they said no, then they are not mentioned by name. Other people I didn't ask because they had assumed public persona. Yeah.
And so naming yourself by name?
It was difficult. For example, if I...
Because, I mean, I think a book like this, it's a beautiful book, but it's also a very dangerous book. And you put yourself and potentially your family at risk.
Yes. If I had to come on your podcast to talk about the book, I mean, I couldn't do it any other way, I mean, I'm launching the book. Remember, I wrote the book mostly in order to get certain messages out. So I can't just write the book. I have to go and speak and get these messages out. So I did at some point initially think of doing that, writing anonymously, because people have written books like that. But I thought that with this book, it will be very difficult to write anonymously. It would be very, also some of the cases I reference, for example, like the attack on my house. The people who carried out the attack obviously know whose house they attacked or they came to attack, So, it simply wasn't going to be practical. To maybe in future I will write books anonymously, but not this one.
So there are a couple of, in fact, lots of people that you mentioned in the book who have also very interesting stories. The only one who's actually written some of his stories is Jeremy Weary, who's written a couple of books. But there are other people, Anwar Dramat, I think, is one of them. Peter Jacobs is mentioned in the book. How do you encourage these guys to write their stories?
All I can say is that in general, these stories add a tremendous value to our society in a number of ways. One, we keep on talking about needing role models. And I think through these stories, we model for younger people who may not, I mean, go to exclusives to buy the book or so on, but, you know, if you can get the story out, I think it because it is a story of determination, of innovation, of leadership, of drive to achieve something, which could be quite encouraging to young people. So that's the one thing. The other thing is that, particular to security and intelligence, we need to, all of us, write and talk. I mean, everyone doesn't have to write a book, you know, and have conversations about the place of intelligence in our society, how to create better, more capable intelligence structures. Writing books is one way of doing that. And so people like Peter and Anwar, Jeremy has written, and others, there are others, you know, who these are people obviously who have a contribution to make to that conversation, which is also a conversation that cannot just be held in closed rooms, because it has, some of it has to take place in public. The discourse has to take place in public. So I think that people should write. You know, people should write to encourage younger people, and people should write to make a contribution to the discourse on security and intelligence. Otherwise, the entire discourse becomes dominated, often by people who have a background that is dissimilar to ours, and who have views on policing that is contrary to the kind of beliefs that we hold. But if you cede that space and you let them speak, but you don't speak, you know, then they come to dominate not just the conversation, but also the decisions that are taken.
Yeah. David, when did you leave intelligence?
2001.
Okay. And so what are you doing at the moment?
Man, I'm doing a whole range of things. Firstly, I'm employed by a think tank that does climate politics and climate geopolitics. So I do, well, I have the fancy title of being the lead for strategic intelligence for this. It's a global think tank. So in that sense, I do political intelligence for this think tank. I still do some training for intelligence and security organizations, the African Union, for example. I work with some other people to train the African Union in intelligence analysis, early warning intelligence, and so on. Similarly, for some of our intelligence structures here at home. And then I write, I mean, apart from the book, but, you know, sometimes I write commentary in the media, and to contribute to this discourse I was referring to. That is what I do professionally, you know, and then, yeah.
And so do you have a sense of the strength of intelligence in South Africa at the moment?
Look, as an ordinary South African, when you say, okay, how strong is your intelligence? You ask yourself, would the intelligence be strong or weak if you have the levels of crime that we do? The levels of organized crime, the levels of murder, gangsterism, the proliferation of drugs, extortion.
Well, was it the July 21?
Yes. So, I mean, it seems to me, you know, obviously I'm not in these structures anymore, but I am obviously a curious person. So I talk to people, I read the news, I study intelligence. And I think that we fall very, very short when it comes to having capable intelligence structures. And I mean, there are many reasons for that. Chiefly, I think, is the lack of a commitment to actually build strong intelligence capability. Because intelligence, let's say, as organizations, crime intelligence, defense intelligence, state security agency. These things can exist without being capable, and you allow them to exist. But in order for them to be capable, you must do certain things, which I, as an observer of intelligence, do not see being done.
Mm. Would you consider coming back to play a role in improving South Africa's intelligence?
No. Look, well, it depends on what you define as a role. I am not the kind of person who fits well in the bureaucracy, firstly. Secondly, I'm the kind of person with significant deficiencies that will not allow me to, for example, lead an intelligence organization, which I recognize. And I have other strengths. I think what is important, let's say for the government, is to say, okay, what do we have inside the government and who do we have that we can use to build our intelligence capability? What and who do we have outside, and how do we use these people? I mean, it could be NGOs, it could be academics, it could be former spies, it could be people in communities, community organizations. How do we go far and wide and select people and say, what can you do for us? What can you as David Africa do for us to help us build a capable intelligence? What can you as Ryland Fisher do for us to build a capable intelligence? Can you teach people how to communicate, how to write, how to edit their documents, whatever? I mean, leadership and so on. And then you coalesce all of these things and you design a South African intelligence capability development program. And you build these intelligence structures from the inside and the outside.
Do you know how the book sales are going?
I understand it's going well. I don't have numbers because I don't really... I didn't write the book in order to sell many of these books, because in South Africa, in any case, many...
But you want the message to get out.
Yes. And so what's more important are the conversations like this one, the launches and so on, because it reaches obviously many more people than would buy a book. But I understand it's doing well. It obviously can and must do better. Yeah.
And so what's next? Do you plan to write some more books in future?
I do.
Maybe not about intelligence, maybe about, I don't know.
I have...
maybe even some fiction.
I'm curious about spy fiction. I'm curious about South African spy fiction operating on the global stage. South African spies, both here and abroad, and placing it in the contemporary geopolitical, imagine South African spies in the US trying to figure out what's going on in Trump. Wouldn't that be interesting? No, so I'm interested in that, but I also have there are some stories when I want to tell, for example, about radical student politics here in Western Cape in the 1980s, which I think was a fascinating period. And I would like to tell some of those stories as well.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you.
Thank you for being a very, very interesting guest.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
I want to thank David Africa for joining us and for sharing his valuable insights with us today. I want to thank MobiLearn for their support. The technical team, once again, a big shout out to you for the great work that you're doing. This is Crossing the Line. You can follow us on most social media platforms, Facebook, LinkedIn, TikTok, Instagram, etc. We welcome your input. If you have any guests that you think we should be inviting on the show, please let us know. If you can think of ways in which you can improve the show, please let us know. We welcome whatever input we receive. Thank you once again, and until next time, goodbye.